After months of turmoil, South Korea has a new president. Moon Jae-in is promising a new approach at home and on the world stage, but is he up to the challenge? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme in Doha. I'm Adrian Finnegan. It's the return of liberalism in South Korea. The election of President Moon Jae-in marks a major shift in the country's political landscape. Conservatives have been in charge for nearly a decade, but after the last 6 months, which ended with the previous president impeached and facing jail, it's not surprising that South Koreans want change. The question is, what will change look like? Moon's policies could lead to dialogue with North Korea, a long-time adversary, and could harm relations with the US, a long-time ally. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Rob McBride reports from Seoul.
Sworn in as the 19th president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in spoke of the burden now placed on his shoulders by his election after the impeachment of his predecessor. But he praised the spirit of the Korean people in overcoming the political turmoil of the previous months. He also said he would do anything to avoid conflict with North Korea.
If needed, I will fly to Washington right away. I will visit Beijing and Tokyo, and if it becomes possible, I will also go to Pyongyang. I will do everything I can to firmly establish peace on the Korean peninsula.
The US is concerned he will take a softer line with North Korea as it takes a hardline approach. Moon has promised to review the installation of the US THAAD missile defense system in South Korea, which he has criticized. The deployment soured relations with China, which has punished South Korea economically.
First on the agenda is economics, because without that, the relationship is meaningless, because at this point, South Korea is really hurting.
President Moon, a former Special Forces soldier, has, however, also promised to maintain strong military ties with the US.
He wants to engage both China and United States to find non-military solution to North Korean nuclear weapons program. On the other hand, he doesn't want to look too dovish, so he's been actually playing up a lot of his military credentials.
And he has pledged to be a different kind of president, saying the office has become too powerful. To help fulfill that promise, President Moon says he wants to change his place of work. Traditionally, presidents occupy the official residence, the Blue House, beyond those gates. But according to Moon, that makes the president too remote. He wants to turn that into a public space, while he moves his office to this far more modest government building. In that new office, he will find a stacked in-tray. Now in charge of a country that has effectively been without presidential leadership for half a year. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Seoul.
All right, let's bring in our guests for today from Busan in South Korea. Robert Kelly, Professor of Political Science and Diplomacy. From Hong Kong, Hwang Jung-wook, a law professor at Hankook University of Foreign Affairs. And from Beijing, Einar Tangen, whom you saw in our report just a moment ago, political affairs analyst and specialist on China. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. I want to get on to the domestic challenges that President Moon faces in just a few moments, but let's begin with South Korea's relations with its allies. Professor Kelly, Robert, is President Moon on a collision course with the Trump administration over the South's future relations with the North?
I think there is at the very top. I think that President Moon and President Trump are very different people, both in terms of character and ideology. Moon is a pretty buttoned-up, serious policy wonk sort of guy. He's a known quantity with policy positions that go back a long time. Donald Trump is almost the exact opposite, right? He's sort of flamboyant, erratic, prone to wild policy swings. I think Moon will probably find him a bit crude, to be perfectly honest. I would imagine I actually think that they'll probably really dislike one another. However, there are pretty deep bureaucratic roots for the South Korean and American alliance. It's been around for a long time. The militaries, the State Department and the Foreign Ministry, they interact a lot. There's a sort of whole world of think tanks that tie the two of them together. So I don't think it will lead to some kind of a major crisis, but I do think at the very top there will be a very deep disagreement. The Trump administration's impulse is hawkishness, whereas the the Moon people. I mean, President Moon today said in his inaugural address he'd like to go to Pyongyang. So that sets up a pretty major ideological split.
Hwang Jung-wook, Professor, do you agree with that? Are President Trump and President Moon's views on how to deal with the North completely opposing points of view? Is Mr. Moon's desire simply to get Pyongyang back to the negotiating table, where, as the US wanted something entirely different?
Yeah, at the same time, I think Mr. Moon, President Moon now actually has commented in the past that he actually agrees with President Trump on a couple of points. One, that strategic patience in the past administrations have turned out to be a failure. But I think a key difference between President Trump and President Moon is going to be whether the military option is going to be a serious option going forward. I think, along with President Moon, virtually every South Korean will agree that, no one wants a second Korean War.
Aina Tangin, we all remember the Sunshine Policy, the South Sunshine Policy towards the North. Are we going to see under President Moon, do you think, a Sunshine Mark II policy?
Well, it's quite possible. If you start looking at his PM and his new spy master, both of them were part of that effort that was up till 2008. And it's quite possible that he's gearing up. His spy master has already said that he's willing to go to Pyongyang, and Moon himself has said under the right conditions, he would also be willing to do so.
So what would the right conditions be?
Well, I think that's left amorphously. I think we haven't really defined what those conditions are. The U.S. has been insisting that Pyongyang put away its nuclear weapons as a precondition to any kind of talks. I don't think that that's necessarily going to be the precondition for North Korea, but it'll be interesting to see what he believes is, quote, the right conditions.
Robert Kelly, how far do you think President Moon is willing to push back against the US? Is there political capital to be won in South Korea in him doing so? Is the US likely to see a critical ally breaking ranks?
Right. I don't think he'll go that far. I think he's constrained by the fact that he's a minoritarian president. He only won 41% of the vote. It's true that there was a far left party that won 6 or 7% as well. So he's roughly, if you sort of throw in those voters, he's around 47, 48%. That's what he got in 2012 when he lost. Moon's coalition just isn't that large, and I don't think that he has the political space at home to run off and do something really outrageous, like go to Pyongyang unless there's some kind of major concession. I also do think that he will run into a wall of American bureaucratic resistance. It's not 1997, 98 when the Sunshine Policy was tried for the first time. I think there's a much greater consensus on the American side that North Korea is a real, genuine global menace now. Nuclearization, missilization, the criminality continues. They just used VX, a WMD, in an airport a couple months ago. I don't think that Moon has the space for it. He just doesn't have a mandate for that kind of adventurism. He could do it, but he'll face crushing criticism in the conservative press at home. That I can say for sure. And the Americans, especially under Donald Trump, will be very, very hostile, I think. He could do it, but he'll provoke a crisis if he does, I think.
Professor Hwang, what do you make of that? Is President Moon at the very least likely to order the removal of that recently implemented missile defense system, which was it came into force just days before he was elected?
Well, actually, President Moon has never been, adamantly against that one way or the other. I think what he has supported is the policy of, actually strategic patience in some sense. Basically, he wanted to be kind of ambiguous about that, using it as a card against China and North Korea at the same time. So he wanted to have a policy space within which he can move around, which the previous administration tried to take away. So I'm not really sure what's going to go on with that. In fact, what China has done is China has been imposing economic sanctions against South Korean companies for placement of that, and actually that has created a backlash within South Korea. And in fact, one policy option that South Korea could look into is to actually purchase additional units of THAAD for its own defenses. Right now, THAAD is being placed in defense of the U.S. military personnel in Korea, but South Korea could actually purchase on its own additional units. I guess one thing I would point out about the potential Sunshine Policy number 2 is that I agree with Professor Kelly that we are not likely to see a Sunshine Policy number 2 anytime soon. But at the same time, I think Mr. Moon, as well as his advisors and supporters kind of view reunification as something that we should all aspire to in the long run. And basically, I guess most South Koreans don't view reunification by military means as a desirable goal, and that actually basically leaves kind of some kind of economic integration, maybe in the model of the European Union going forward between the two Koreas. But that is going to be a long-term project.
Professor Kelly, do you want to come back on that?
Sure. I think that some kind of federation between North and South Korea, that's sort of been thrown around for a while. I think that's sort of the left's answer to the right's insistence on strict unification under Southern terms. The problem with that, I think, is that North Korea probably wouldn't really shift its political system very much, which would make a federation effectively South Korea subsidizing a dictatorship. This is why the Kaesong Industrial Zone was closed a couple of years ago, because what had originally been an effort to sort of integrate the two Koreas economically, get them interacting, actually became a little enclave economy that was effectively subsidizing North Korea to the tune of $100 million a year in cash, U.S. cash, I might add, right? Any kind of federation is going to run exactly into that same kind of crushing moral criticism, not only in the South Korean conservative press, which is dead opposed to this kind of stuff, but also in the United States, which thinks that the Sunshine Policy may have been a noble experiment and was tried, but by the end of it was an error, that it effectively had become patronizing North Korea. This is the hill that Moon has to climb. His impulses may be to do this, but almost all of South Korea's democratic partners, the United States, Japan, external allies, the Europeans, are not comfortable with this, and that's just a high wall to climb.
Anna Tangen, how would China view the reopening of that Kaesong Industrial Park in the demilitarized zone, having implemented the limited sanctions of its own against the North? What would China's view be?
Well, it's interesting supposition. The fact is that Pyongyang and Beijing are at historic lows in terms of trust. There's been open criticism going back and forth between different media groups. It's clear that there is a lack of trust coming from Pyongyang towards Beijing. They have hinted or said explicitly that they believe that China is following the U.S. So I don't know that the ground is ripe for that. But with all of this talk about what could happen, things like that, the question is, what are the alternatives and what are the issues? And quite frankly, the issue is Young Kim's desire to survive in his own way, in charge of his country. And the issue from the other side is nuclear arms. So there is a possibility that China could step in and say, we will guarantee the North Korean current government, as long as there's a path towards reunification, as long as South Korea agrees. This is one possible way in which it could bypass the U.S. Because at this point, it is impossible, and I agree with all of my colleagues, that the U.S. will back off at any time over this issue.
I'd read somewhere, Anna, that China is basically happy to preserve the status quo at the moment, to keep the North's nuclear program just where it is at the moment, to freeze it and allow the US to do the heavy lifting in terms of negotiations that would most likely take years. What do you make of that?
I think that's a lot of nonsense, quite frankly. I mean, it is not in China's interest to have any kind of nuclear program alive and kicking. Quite frankly, it would stir up a nuclear arms race throughout Asia, Southeast Asia. As the only nuclear power, China is certainly not, has no appetite to see others gaining the same things. So I really don't know where this kind of thinking comes from. I think it's a bit absurd. It's like saying the U.S. would favor a nuclear Cuba. I mean, it's not a pre-nuclear Cuba. This is not the kind of calculation that any kind of sane government makes. And as we all know, China may be a little difficult in terms of strategy, but it is very long on planning.
Robert Kelly, just briefly, I saw you grinning there when I asked that question.
Yeah, sure. I'm trying to imagine the Americans fighting alone to get the North Koreans to denuclearize. Man, that's just never going to happen. If anybody's going to get this to happen, it's going to be the Chinese, because they're the only ones with any kind of indoor into Pyongyang. And even that indoor is pretty narrow, right? I don't think anybody really believes the Chinese have a lot of political leverage. I mean, the real issue is the economic leverage that China has, which is fairly oblique. It's like, cutting off the luxury good trade, which they're supposed to do anyway because it's sanctioned, cutting off fuel oil, which has been rumored in the last couple of weeks. That's the kind of stuff, those are the kinds of cards that China can play. The United States is sort of getting close to the point where it's either airstrikes or learning to live with North Korea with nuclear weapons. I would say only that the United States has learned to live with Russian and for that Soviet nuclear weapons with the ability to strike continental United States and China also. We, the Americans, have lived with nuclear deterrence for a long time. It seems possible to me that we could learn to live with North Korea having that capability too, but I find it highly unlikely that North Korea will voluntarily denuclearize. They simply will not get the credibility assurance, like the credible assurances they want in order to give them up. I mean, it makes sense to keep them.
Okay, I want to move on to domestic issues in just a moment, but first, very briefly, Professor Huang, to what extent is President Moon's presidency, his time in office, going to be all about navigating between China and the US?
Well, basically, he has an impossible task. I mean, as other panelists have discussed, we have powerful players who with different interests, and North Korea really firmly refusing to budge on the nuclear issue. I think in North Korea's leadership, they're looking at basically Libya's example, where Libya's Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program and basically ended up being abandoned by the Western powers. And I think that's the lesson that North Korea has learned, and it's not likely to give up its nuclear weapons anytime soon.
All right, we've been talking a lot about how Moon's victory will affect South Korea's foreign affairs, but he's also got a lot to tackle domestically. He has to stabilize South Korea after 6 months of political turmoil. As we reported earlier, the previous president, Park Geun-hye, was impeached following a corruption scandal and mass protests. The saga also raised questions about the power of the chaebols. Now, they are massive family-run businesses that are known for influencing politics in South Korea. Moon's under pressure to end that relationship, and he also needs to address the stagnant economy. The chaebols are so powerful that small and middle-sized businesses struggle to grow, and 1 in 10 young people is unemployed. Aina Tangen, as far as corruption and reforming the economy are concerned, is President Moon going to be able to achieve everything that he's promised with so many powerful, interested parties who won't take kindly to his plans? Can he do it?
Well, as my colleague in Korea pointed out, he is not a strong actor. He will not have a majority of the parliament, their governing body. Is backing him on his very, very ambitious goals. He's talked about 810,000 new jobs. He's talked about an $8 billion stimulus plan. It's all right now is in the clouds because he has to be able to deliver a government that can actually govern. So there is grave reasons for South Korea to be very, very concerned. They've dropped from 3.3% growth in 2015 to 2.8 in 2016, and they're scheduled for 2.6. They have a declining population, high unemployment among the youth. As you pointed out, very stagnant economy. He has to get things going, but he's going to have to find some sort of middle ground. And unfortunately, the chaebols control so much of this. It will take literally something like a Glass-Steagall Act to separate them into their different components and prevent them from strangling the very economy that they're supposed to be helping.
Robert Kelly, what do you make of that? I mean, to a certain extent, you were saying that he might be a minority president, with 41% of the vote, but it was the economy, jobs, and anti-corruption policies that South Koreans voted for, wasn't it? That was why they wanted him as president.
Sure. First, let me say that I think both of what the two of you said before me was absolutely correct. The chaebol are sort of this stultifying force, and yeah, the oligopoly or de-oligopolization, antitrust. These are really big issues that have been hanging around for a long time, and at some point, somebody's got to deal with this. The chaebol has just become too large. I do think there is a window of opportunity on this, though. In the past, the left has tried to reform the chaebol, and it hasn't really worked because there's a lot of public sympathy. There's a sort of strong perception in South Korea that the chaebol are responsible for the economic miracle of the 60s and 70s, and they sort of managed to play on those public sympathies to push back against government efforts to clean them up. This time, though, they have gotten in a lot of trouble because they got sucked into the scandal that pulled down Park Geun-hye, right? The Chaegate. They've actually, the head of Samsung is now in prison, which is actually, sort of fairly remarkable given Samsung's sort of, clout here, its sort of status as national champion. So I think that's what Moon has to capitalize on. He's got to sort of run with this idea with a public perception right now that the chaebol are fairly corrupted by what happened before, and he's got to push for, as the other speakers have said, a greater division between the state and the chaebol, right? I mean, the biggest reason why the chaebol can do these things is because they're so large and they're so infected, they're so slid into politics, their tentacles are so much into politics that they sort of throw around a lot of money, and this gets them off the hook regulatorily, right? This gets them, sort of political favors, soft credit from the banks and things like that. The only way to sort of roll that stuff back is to really draw a line, a much thicker wall between the state and business. That's why I think it's so difficult to do this, because, state intervention in the economy is sort of at the heart of the Korean economic model. So this isn't just him saying, oh, the people have to behave better and clean up their balance sheets. This is actually, I would argue, this is something along the lines of a social revolution. This is getting South Koreans to think differently about economic development, and that's going to be hard.
Hwang Jung-wook, do you agree with that? Do you disagree?
Well, actually, I would like to divide up the two issues a little bit. One is the chaebol reform, and the other is economic stimulus. On the chaebol reform, I mean, these are the really powerful interest groups in Korea, and I don't think anybody really thinks that the reforms will take place within 2 or 3 years. I mean, if you think back to the U.S. history during the progressive era, Standard Oil wasn't broken up until 1911 after a long years of Supreme Court fight. And even though President Moon might not have a lot of political capital in terms of votes in the National Assembly, he does control prosecutors, he does control National Tax Service, he does control Korean Fair Trade Commission, which are all very powerful tools against chaebol. So I think it will actually see long-term reform movement against chaebols to actually free up their market power. On the economic stimulus, I mean, I think this is something that needs to be done immediately. I mean, because of the political turmoil, the Korean economic stagnation has been sort of covered up in the Korean media. But in the late last year, the Korean Statistics Office released a figure saying that the bottom 10% of the Korean population, their income level actually dropped year to year around 16 percentage points. I mean, that is a huge drop for people who are basically living day to day. So I think immediate economic stimulus is very much needed, and that's what President Moon is doing. His call for 810,000 jobs, it really does harken back to the New Deal era with various programs introduced under FDR. And I do hope that within next few months we'll see economic stimulus being put in place, and hopefully President Moon can build a political coalition to actually pull that through.
Aina Tangen, have you heard anything there that changes your view? Come back to the question. The president has so much to do. He's promised that he's going to do all this stuff. Can he?
Well, the elephant in the room is obviously China. I mean, for the last 2 months, the number of cars sold, Korean cars sold in China has dropped by more than 50% each month. This is a staggering amount for an economy that is 25% of its GDP is dependent upon exports, and 1/3 of those exports involve China. So under this particular things, he has to do something about that. If he can negotiate something with China that delays it, I think China will take off the screws, and the embargo, the unofficial embargo, will be lifted, and this will give him some room to maneuver. Without that, it looks very, very dim.
Robert, we're running out of time. One last question for you. We think of South Korea as being a prosperous, modern economy, people generally well off, have a good standard of living. What was President Moon's appeal among ordinary South Koreans? Why did they vote for him?
I would argue that it was it was simply a big backlash against the right. Almost any left-wing candidate would have done well. This is akin to the rout of the Republican Party in 1974 and 76 after Watergate. So in that sense, he just benefited from the times. I think Moon is also seen as sort of a fairly upright kind of guy. I mean, if you look at him, he's sort of straight-laced and buttoned up and sort of very professorial. He has a kind of Obama kind of sheen to him with the sort of seriousness and the glasses and sort of lawyerly way that he speaks. He's also pretty clean, right? And I think the other candidates were all sort of not, they were weak. The guy on the right called himself the Donald Trump of Korea, which struck everybody as a gimmick given how unpopular Donald Trump is here. And the centrist, who was supposed to be sort of this reformist candidate who was going to sort of sweep the race, he really flamed out in the debate, and I think Moon just kind of picked up the pieces.
There we're going to have to end our discussion. Gentlemen, many thanks indeed for being with us. Robert Kelly, Hwang Jung-wook and Aina Tangen. As always, thank you for watching the program. Don't forget you can see Inside Story again at any time just by going to the website. You'll find that at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us on Facebook at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.